these research talks, the third talk we present, we try to look for a speaker outside academic research. So in this case, we've got someone from the publishing world. In the future, we'll have people from industry or people from scientific journalism, and so on and so forth, just to have a look at what's going on in the world of neuroscience. It's not necessarily strictly not necessarily lab research. So today we have Dr. Asante is going to give us a talk about publishing. So since 2012, he's been a senior editor at Nature Communications at the London desk. He received his doctorate from UCL, studying mechanisms of spinal pain processing in 2009, and was a postdoctoral research assistant from 2010 to 2012 at City College of the City University of New York, studying development connectivity of functional locomotor circuits. So he'll be giving an overview of how the publishing process works. Please welcome Dr. Asante.
So it's a bit weird to be back here. Last time I was actually in this room, I was giving a talk on my final year, PhD. So mixed feelings about being back. I do come back to UCL every now and again. As you heard, I work for Nature Communications. So I started, actually my undergraduate degree was a pharmacology degree. So there wasn't really any neuroscience in that. But then I did a placement year at Sharp and Down Neuroscience Research Centre, and I spent a year working on cognition enhancing compounds, and that's really what got my interest in neuroscience. And then I decided to do a PhD, which is when I came to UCL after my undergraduate degree. And then I worked with Tony Dickinson, if anybody knows him, and that's where I did my PhD. And then I went to New York, and I came to do a postdoc, and then I came back to London for this job. So I work for Nature Communications, part of Nature Publishing Group. This slide basically kind of depicts the Nature Publishing Group family. So we have Nature at the top, which is the flagship journal for Nature Publishing Group, and they publish all the big stories, the high impact stories. And then we go down to Nature research journals, so Nature Neuroscience, for example, will publish papers which are of broad interest to neuroscientists in general. And then we have Nature Communications, which is a much more specialist journal, and that will publish papers which are specific or of interest to very specific communities. And then we have Scientific Reports, which is more of a community-driven journal, so that publishes technically sound research. And Nature Publishing Group operate a transfer process. So when the journals were launched originally, there was a lot of, they were designed actually to be quite competitive with each other, Nature standing outside of that. So all the research journals, for example, Nature Neuroscience and Nature Medicine will often compete for the same kinds of papers. But now there's a big push to actually relax some of this editorial independence, in the sense that Nature Publishing Group are trying to keep as many papers within the family. So now editors are often working together with the authors to try and find a good venue for them to publish. So whether that be Nature or Nature research journals or Nature Communications, the aim is to stop papers from leaving Nature Publishing Group. So Nature Communications is online only, multidisciplinary, so publish papers in biology, chemistry, physics, earth sciences, publishing daily at the moment, have an editorial advisory panel. So originally the editorial advisory panel were there to assist the editors, because there were very few editors covering a wide range of subjects, and the editorial advisory panel will be there to kind of give us an idea as to whether a paper was worth pursuing. At the moment we have an open access option, but as of next Monday, Nature Communications will be fully open access. So this is quite a big deal actually for Nature Publishing group as a whole to have a journal that goes fully open access. It's online only, so there's no news and view section, no front half, which is what you would often see in Nature and the Nature research journals. It's just purely research articles. We also publish some reviews, and the impact factor for anybody that is interested puts us third in multidisciplinary research journals behind Nature and Science. And so, as I said, hybrid open access. At the moment, it's hybrid. From next Monday, it will be fully open access. Around 40% of our papers are open access, probably a bit lower than 40%. And we publish CC BY, so this is gold standard in terms of open access. If anybody wants to know about the licenses, we can go into that, but it's maybe not that interesting for this talk. And then we have a whole list of editors. So our editors are actually split between the London office, New York, and Shanghai. Some of these editors are actually on maternity leave, and the whole point of this is really just to show you how much biological sciences is split. And then we have a similar kind of setup for the physical sciences, which you don't need to really know about. So submission, what do you need to submit a paper? So I guess this really applies to you if you're writing a paper in general, if you're writing of your results, or you're writing an essay or a thesis or whatever. The most important thing is to establish the context of the field. So why is your research important? And I think that's probably the easiest thing. It's probably what you've already decided upon before you even do the research. Explaining what you've done and explaining it clearly. Linking results back to context in a way that convinces others that you've made significant progress. Often, and sometimes we see this in the office, is that people are really good at explaining what they've done and then explaining their results, but it's very but from that point on, the paper tends to become incoherent because the authors will often just explain result after result after result after result without putting it in any kind of context or having any kind of strong bottom line. And the purpose is to communicate results efficiently rather than to impress. So not every paper that we publish is going to have the cure for cancer. But there will still be some very valuable information within that paper that should be published and that people should find out about. And a paper should really stand up on its own without having to force the issue. Editors at Nature Communication often are getting about 15 to 20 manuscripts, new manuscripts a week. The editors will often make their decisions on those papers as to whether they're going to send out the paper to review or send it back to the author, so the author can then decide what they want to do. And when we often send the papers back to the authors, we'll give them some advice as to where they should probably submit their research. As standard, we tell them to go to to scientific reports. And not all authors will take that up, but there are a whole range of journals within Nature Publishing Group and outside of Nature Publishing Group which might be suitable venues. So we're rejecting about 60 to 80%, and these are going straight back to the author, and then the rest we're sending out to peer review. So the editorial process, so we often aim to get first decision back to the author within a week. So that decision is basically, are we going to pursue this manuscript, and are we sending it out to review, or are we sending it back to the authors? Will assess the significance of the paper. So that's the main part of our decision-making process, assessing the significance. But then we'll often check to see if the conclusions, broadly speaking, can be supported. At least one editor reads the paper. Often we discuss the papers with other editors. Because of the wide expertise and different experiences of the editors, it's quite useful to do that and to get second opinions. And then we'll assign 2 to 4 referees per paper. So So these referees will be experts in the field. They'll either be experts in the topic, or they'll be very specific experts in the sense of techniques. So, you know, we might have a paper about genetics of autism, for example. So we might have an expert on autism, but then we'll have some geneticists who might not be experts in autism, but they'll be able to assess the techniques. And for a lot of these genetics papers, genetics analysis are quite complicated, so you do need very specific expertise for that. We aim for a turnover time of 4 to 6 weeks for that decision after review. Very often that's out of our hands. We chase reviewers, but you know, and we give them 7 days, for example, to return a report. But in practice, it never really works out that way. What do we look for? So nature journals, all nature journals look for scientific significance. And then those points below is when it starts to get a bit subjective and varies from journal to journal. So data supporting conclusions, yes, that's true for all journals, not just Nature Communications or Nature Research journals, but all journals, you'd hope. Novelty varies from journal to journal. For Nature Communications editors, assessing the novelty is quite difficult because we are trying to place ourselves below Nature, which is quite easy, but then the research journals, not so much, and then trying to separate ourselves from other journals as well. So that's really where the decision making starts to get quite difficult. Interesting for journals readership, again, that's quite subjective. A significant step forward is another subjective category, but all the editors are really good at kind of setting a bar and keeping that bar quite stable. Impact in the field. For Nature Communications, we're just interested about what's going to be interesting to specialists. So within neuroscience, for example, what's going to be interesting and significant for cognitive neuroscientists or people who study Alzheimer's disease, and provides new directions for new research. So the paper will obviously not be closed chapter, but you know, it will provide, it might be extremely important that the paper is published because it will help others to progress the field and so on. So the decisions after review is where it gets, this is probably what takes up most of the time as an editor, because they're not always that straightforward. So we've sent them out to review, and the reviewers have commented on the paper, and the paper's come back, and we have 1 of 4 decisions. So we can either accept the paper outright. That hardly ever happens. We can ask the authors to revise the paper, or we can reject it because there are lots of revisions that they need to make. So this reject big revisions is kind of like the door is kind of left open because we tell them that if you can address them and if you do have experimental data that can address the concerns, then we would be willing to consider it. But often the paper has a lot of work, and we can reject outright because it's completely flawed. So within those different categories, we will often give the authors a lot more specific advice as to what's wrong with the paper, you know, what they might need to do. We'll often take phone calls, and what isn't actually included there are appeals, and that comes after rejection. So if an author is unhappy with our decision to reject a paper, and they have the right to appeal. Some of them work out, some of them don't. And that's it. So I kept it intentionally short. Just, you know, if you had questions, that'd be really good.
How did you move from your postdoc work to do a publication?
Yeah, Yeah, it's a good question. So when I was a postdoc, so first of all, I never did my degree intending to become an editor. I always wanted to be in the lab and end up running my own lab. And then when I became a postdoc, it was a great postdoc. You know, I did science. I had a great team. I was living in New York. You know, it was fun. But then I realized that I had to start getting serious. It's quite competitive. And for me, I just realized that, my heart wasn't in it so much that I was really willing to, keep sacrificing a lot of things just to be a really great academic. And, it was the right decision for me. It's not the right decision for everybody. But for me it was. And then I just started making a lot of contacts. I started reading up about the job. I asked for advice from people. I asked friends of friends who I knew were working in the industry and things like that. And they were able to tell me, the ins and outs of the job and, what I needed to be an editor. So I didn't have any direct experience. I'd reviewed some papers, but it was more a case of just being interested in my area of science, but then also being interested in other areas of science, and being able to assess papers, making use of those journal clubs that I go on all the time, talking about science all the time, proofreading other people's work, things like that. So a lot of these skills I think helped me for the interview and for the manuscript test, which they gave me in the interview.
The question at the back, question? What? Oh. Well, I have one then. How do you go through working out where to send the paper? So how do you work out who you're going to use your reviewers? How do you make that decision?
And how do we assign a reviewer? So we look at their backgrounds, we look at if they're established in the field. We tend to look at how much they've published. So we'll often send our papers to lab heads or very experienced postdocs. And sometimes we'll send them to less experienced postdocs if a supervisor says, well, I'm going to do this in collaboration with my postdoc. But the main things that we're looking for in terms of their background is whether they're an expert in the topic, but then also if they have any expertise with the techniques. So
do you take into consideration the little political squabbles people have? So if that guy in this lab doesn't like this guy in that lab,
so
and this guy's doing the same work trying to get his paper out first, is that?
Yeah, so we it's really hard for us to tell those things, if there are any of those issues, unless an author tells us that there are these issues. So we do tell the authors that they're allowed to exclude people that they don't want to review their paper. They'll often exclude people that they feel there might be a conflict of interest, or they'll exclude direct competitors. And it's very hard for us to know that unless they tell us. We're covering very different areas of science, so we can't actually be on top of it all. And sometimes actually reviewers will come back to us and they will say, well, actually I have a conflict of interest because I'm working on something very similar, which is quite nice. Not all scientists are like that, but it's nice when you do get some that are like that. We do have cases where reviewers will accept, and we don't know if there is a conflict of interest, but they will sit on papers for a really long time. You will chase them, they won't return the papers, things like that. And then you just have to kind of find other people to replace them. So it's funny because you would assume that science is not very cutthroat, right? Everyone is a purist and everyone is doing it for science and the love of science. But scientists are some of the most competitive people out there, for good reason. It's all about money. In terms of, you qualify that, it's all about money in terms of getting funding for your lab rather than making millions.
Thank you very much.